The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, thick and official-looking, bearing the seal of the Pine Ridge Valley Homeowners Association. David Chen, a 47-year-old civil engineer who'd inherited his grandfather's cabin in the Colorado mountains 3 years earlier, set down his coffee and opened it with the kind of careful precision he applied to everything in his life. The letter demanded he cease all improvements to his property, pay $12,000 in back HOA fees he'd never known existed, and submit to a property inspection within 14 days. The signature at the bottom belonged to Patricia Westmore, HOA president, a name David had never heard before. What Patricia didn't know was that David's grandfather had been meticulous about property records, and hidden in a fireproof box in the cabin's basement were documents that would turn Patricia's entire power structure to dust. But that revelation was still 2 weeks away, and David had a lot of research to do first. Before we dive into how David discovered the truth buried in century-old property records, if you love stories where entitled people finally meet their match and justice is served with surgical precision, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how a civil engineer used his own skills to dismantle an HOA's illegal power grab. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a careful man to investigate deeper than anyone expected, the confrontation where a paper tiger discovered it had been living on borrowed ground, and the resolution where property rights were restored through the very laws the HOA claimed to represent. The violation wasn't just a threatening letter. It was years of an HOA that had quietly expanded its authority over properties it had no legal claim to, collecting fees from intimidated owners who didn't know better, while the real property owners watched their access roads crumble under neglect. David's grandfather had built his cabin in 1962, decades before the Pine Ridge Valley development even existed, on land with water rights and road easements that predated everything around it. The confrontation came when David walked into an HOA meeting with a leather portfolio containing surveyor maps, quitclaim deeds, and a legal opinion that made the HOA's attorney go pale. And the resolution involved a chain and padlock on a gate that 87 families had used for 20 years, forcing them to understand that easements work both ways. Here's exactly how it happened. David Chen had never wanted to be a cabin owner. When his grandfather passed away at 92, leaving him the modest 2-bedroom structure tucked into a valley clearing 40 miles west of Denver, David had considered selling it immediately. He was a busy man, managing large-scale infrastructure projects for the Colorado Department of Transportation, and the cabin felt like a relic from another era. But his wife Emma had fallen in love with the place during their first visit, and their 2 teenage daughters had begged to keep it as a family retreat. So David had kept it, visiting 3 or 4 times a year for long weekends, gradually updating the plumbing and electrical systems with the same methodical care his grandfather had taught him. The property sat on 11 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with a creek running through the eastern boundary and a dirt road connecting it to County Road 47. It was peaceful, private, and completely his, or so he'd thought. The first letter had arrived 6 months earlier, a friendly-looking notice welcoming him to the Pine Ridge Valley HOA community and requesting he fill out a homeowner information form. David had thrown it away, assuming it was a mistake. His property wasn't part of any HOA. His grandfather had bought the land outright in 1961 from a rancher, and the cabin had stood there for 63 years without anyone claiming authority over it. But the letters kept coming, each one slightly more insistent than the last. There was a request for architectural review of the new metal roof David had installed. There was a notice about approved paint colors. There was a violation warning about his firewood storage being visible from the road. David had ignored them all, bewildered by the audacity of an HOA claiming jurisdiction over property that predated its existence by 40 years. Then came the certified letter with the $12,000 demand, and David stopped being bewildered. He became methodical. That evening, after a long day reviewing bridge stress calculations at work, he drove to the cabin alone. The basement was musty and cool, lined with shelves his grandfather had built to store canned goods and emergency supplies. In the back corner sat the fireproof box David had opened only once before, during the estate settlement. Inside were his grandfather's property documents, organized in labeled folders with the kind of obsessive detail that only a retired postal worker could achieve. David spread everything across the cabin's kitchen table and began to read. The deed was straightforward. 11 acres purchased from Harold Morrison in October 1961 for $8,000. But attached to the deed was something David had skimmed past during probate, a road easement agreement, signed by Morrison and recorded with the county, granting David's grandfather perpetual access across Morrison's remaining land to reach County Road 47. David studied the surveyor's map, tracing the easement with his finger. It ran for nearly a mile through what was now the heart of Pine Ridge Valley development. Every single home in that HOA used the same road his grandfather's easement had established. And there was more. A water rights document from 1962 granted his grandfather's property access to Morrison Creek, the same creek that fed the HOA's decorative ponds and irrigation system. A mineral rights deed that reserved subsurface rights to the property in perpetuity. And most importantly, a quitclaim deed from 1998, when the Morrison family had sold their ranch to Pine Ridge Developers LLC, explicitly acknowledging and preserving all existing easements and rights. David took photos of every document. Then he made copies. Then he called his college roommate Marcus, who'd become a real estate attorney in Boulder, and asked him to review everything. Marcus called back 2 days later, barely containing his excitement. The documents were ironclad. Not only was David's property completely independent of the HOA, but the HOA's primary access road existed solely because of an easement David now controlled as his grandfather's heir. The HOA had built their community assuming the road was public access, but it wasn't. It was private property, granted as a courtesy that could theoretically be revoked if the easement terms were violated. And demanding fees from the easement holder for using his own access road definitely qualified as a violation. David spent the next week researching Colorado property law, HOA regulations, and easement rights. He drove to the county assessor's office and pulled every property record for Pine Ridge Valley. He discovered that the HOA had been sending similar letters to 4 other pre-existing property owners in the area, collecting fees from people who had no legal obligation to pay. He found that Patricia Westmore had become HOA president 3 years ago and had immediately begun an aggressive expansion campaign, trying to claim authority over anything within the valley's geographical boundaries, regardless of actual legal jurisdiction. He learned that the HOA had recently voted to install a security gate at the entrance to their road, which happened to be David's easement road, and planned to issue access cards only to fee-paying members. That gate would cut off David's legal access to his own property. That was when David decided he'd been patient enough. The monthly HOA meeting was held on the 3rd Thursday of every month at the Pine Ridge Valley Clubhouse, a building David had driven past dozens of times without ever considering entering. On October 19th, he arrived at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the meeting started, carrying a leather portfolio that had belonged to his grandfather, and wearing the same Navy suit he wore to present engineering reports to the state legislature. The community room was already half full, couples in their 50s and 60s chatting over coffee and cookies. Patricia Westmore stood near the front, a tall woman with perfect silver hair and the kind of confident posture that came from years of getting her way. She noticed David immediately, her eyes narrowing as he took a seat in the front row without introducing himself. The meeting began with standard business: approval of last month's minutes, a treasurer's report showing healthy reserves, discussion of landscaping bids. Then Patricia moved to new business, and her voice took on a harder edge. She mentioned the ongoing issue of non-compliant property owners in the valley who were refusing to acknowledge HOA authority and pay their fair share for road maintenance and community services. She didn't mention David by name, but her eyes flicked toward him twice. That was when David raised his hand. Patricia's smile was condescending as she acknowledged him. David stood, opened his portfolio, and introduced himself clearly. Then he began to speak, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. He explained that his grandfather had owned his property since 1961, decades before Pine Ridge Valley existed. He explained that his property had never been part of any HOA and never would be. He explained that the road Patricia kept mentioning, the road every single home in this development used to access County Road 47, existed because of an easement granted to his grandfather in 1961 and transferred to David upon inheritance. He pulled out a surveyor's map and held it up, showing the easement's path highlighted in yellow, running directly through the community. Then he pulled out the easement agreement itself, certified copies with county recorder stamps, and began reading the relevant sections aloud. His voice was calm, professional, the same voice he used to explain engineering specifications to contractors who'd cut corners. The easement granted perpetual access to the Chen property, he explained. It also stipulated that any interference with that access, or any attempt to charge fees for using the easement, would constitute a material violation, allowing the easement holder to restrict access to others using the same path. Patricia tried to interrupt. David didn't let her. He continued, pulling out the quitclaim deed from 1998 showing that Pine Ridge developers had explicitly acknowledged and preserved all existing easements when they purchased the Morrison Ranch. He pulled out his research showing 4 other property owners who'd been intimidated into paying illegal fees. He pulled out the HOA's own meeting minutes from 6 months ago, discussing the planned security gate, which would physically block his easement access. And then he pulled out the legal opinion from Marcus, which stated in clear terms that the HOA had zero jurisdiction over his property, that demanding fees constituted harassment, and that installing a gate across his easement without his written permission would result in immediate legal action. The room was silent except for the sound of papers rustling as David methodically laid out each document on the table at the front. Patricia's face had gone from confident to confused to pale. The HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking man in his 30s, was furiously typing on his phone, presumably looking up easement law. David let the silence stretch. Then he made his offer. The HOA could acknowledge that his property and the 4 others were independent and cease all demands immediately. They could abandon plans for the security gate, or they could install it only with his written approval and provide him with permanent, unrestricted access. They could issue formal apologies and refunds to the property owners they'd been collecting illegal fees from. And in exchange, David would continue to allow the HOA community to use his easement road exactly as they had been, without interference. Or, David continued, his voice dropping slightly, they could continue on their current path. They could install their gate without his permission. They could keep demanding fees he didn't owe. And he would respond by exercising his legal right to restrict easement access to his property alone, which would require every single home in Pine Ridge Valley to find an alternative route to County Road 47, which according to his research didn't exist. The HOA would be effectively landlocked, and property values would crater overnight. He gave them 72 hours to decide. Then he collected his documents, nodded politely to the stunned room, and walked out. Patricia tried calling him the next morning. David didn't answer. She tried again that afternoon, leaving a voicemail that suggested perhaps there had been a misunderstanding and they should discuss this calmly. David texted back a single sentence, "You have 61 hours." On Saturday morning, 48 hours after the meeting, Marcus received a formal communication from the HOA's attorney requesting a meeting to discuss terms. David agreed to meet on Monday morning at Marcus's office in Boulder. Patricia arrived with her attorney and 2 HOA board members, all carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of forced pleasantness. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. The HOA agreed to every single one of David's terms, in writing, with signatures notarized before they left. They would formally acknowledge that David's property and the 4 others were not subject to HOA jurisdiction. They would issue refunds totaling $47,000 to property owners who'd paid illegal fees. They would abandon the security gate plan entirely. And they would issue a formal letter to all HOA members explaining the easement situation and making clear that David's cooperation was a courtesy, not an obligation. But David wasn't finished. The following weekend, he drove to his cabin with a truck full of equipment. At the exact point where his private easement road met County Road 47, technically on his grandfather's original property boundary, he installed 2 large posts on either side of the road. Between them, he mounted a sturdy metal gate that swung open freely but could be locked with a heavy chain and padlock. He didn't lock it. He left it standing open, exactly as it had always been. But hanging from the gate was a professionally made sign that read, Private Easement CHEN Property Access BY Permission. Below that, in smaller letters, Easement established 1961, County Recorder Document 1961-2847, unauthorized interference prohibited by law. He took a photo of the gate and texted it to Patricia with a message. Reminder that this access is a privilege, not a right. I'm happy to keep it open as long as we understand each other. 2 months later, on a cold December morning, David sat on his cabin's front porch with Emma, watching their daughters build a snowman in the meadow. The creek burbled peacefully under its coating of ice. The road, his road, stretched empty and quiet toward the county highway. He'd received a formal apology letter from the HOA, along with an invitation to their holiday party that he'd politely declined. The other 4 property owners had called to thank him, sharing stories of years of intimidation they'd endured because they hadn't known their rights. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Helen, had sent him a bottle of expensive bourbon with a note that said simply, "For standing up when the rest of us were too tired to fight." Patricia Westmore had resigned as HOA president in November, citing personal reasons, though David suspected the recall petition circulating among members who'd learned about the illegal fee collection had helped her make that decision. The gate still stood at the road entrance, unlocked and open, a quiet reminder that property rights mattered more than assumed authority. David's grandfather had been a man of few words, but he'd always said that the most important thing you could own was proof of what was yours. Looking at the documents now safely stored in both the fireproof box and a bank safety deposit box, David understood exactly what he'd meant. Because justice, whether it came from a courtroom or from a century-old easement agreement, and a man who refused to be intimidated, was equally satisfying. Across the country in Boise, Idaho, software developer Jennifer Patel was receiving her 3rd cease and desist letter from her HOA demanding she remove the vegetable garden from her front yard when she stumbled across something interesting in her property deed. An agricultural exemption clause from 1947 that predated the entire subdivision and specifically protected farming activities on her lot. She smiled, the same smile she used when debugging impossible code, and began drafting an email to the HOA's attorney. "Let's discuss which of us actually read the property records before moving in," she wrote. The board president's response arrived within the hour, considerably less confident than his previous letters. But that's a story for another time.